Let's start at something you might have experienced yourself. Let's see what we can learn about climate anxiety.
Look at anxiety first, because then it just applies to climate related topics afterwards. A behavioral view of anxiety is going to look at, there's a couple like prongs to this. First is just like this ability that we have to engage in language is actually very uniquely human. There's a little bit of stuff that kind of seems to happen with a few other species. You look at dolphins as a popular example, but like you look around in society and what we've built and what we're destroying simultaneously, like that is in large part due to our belief that we're able to language, talk, reason, etc. Rather than just learning through direct experience, like contacting a situation. So I walk over, I touch the stove, and the stove's hot and it hurts my hand. We could have the ability, not that we always do this, but we have the ability to learn through stories or language, right? Someone could say, hey, we're sticking with the stove topic, right? Like say when you're younger, you touch the stove and it kind of burnt you. And like, let's say later on, I don't know, let's say that there's some hot springs or like a bathtub or something like that that you're near. And someone says, oh, careful, if you touch that, it's really hot. It's just like that time when you touch the stove. Something like that can get you like immediately like, oh, like that hurts me, and you didn't have to directly contact that. I think we take this for granted because it happens so often, but that ability is very uniquely human. The amount of stuff that we learn in our lifetime through not directly contacting things, but through stories or examples like that happens like really fast. What's interesting there is that anything around anxiety disorders and experiencing anxiety tends to really happen through a lot of that indirect learning happening without us wanting it to occur. And so an example of this is like if I were to ask you to think about a lemon, right? And really think about like biting into a lemon, the feeling when the lemon juice fills your mouth, like what starts to happen? Not for everyone, but for listeners and both of you, I literally every time I talk about this, like my mouth starts to water a bit. Like that watering of your mouth is happening without you trying to make it happen yourself. Like it's just, it occurs, right? There's actually some really fascinating research that was done in the early 90s that showed that this happens and that this is like out of our control, which I think is a really unique thing when we're talking about anxiety. Just a quick sidestep on this. What they did is they taught people A is bigger than B is bigger than C. So the idea is just like these arbitrary letters. And you could be like, okay, A's at the highest level, B's in the middle, and C's at the lowest. And they would teach people, and they controlled for it a lot of different ways to be able to, like, it wasn't just letters, but like to simplify this, they taught people like there's these hierarchical relations, like something is bigger, something's medium, something's small. They, with like consent of all of this, it sounds a little crazy nowadays, I think, but what they did is for a certain number of the subjects, what they did is they took the B stimulus, showed it, provided a mild shock. That mild shock was just enough to create a little bit of that like anxiety response, right? What they found is when they showed the A stimulus, people would be more scared than the B stimulus experience. And then the C, since it was lower, would give them a less of a response. So just from experiencing the bad thing with B, they also experience now more bad stuff with A and less bad stuff with C. So I always give this example, like if someone thought about something that was like pretty heartbreaking or pretty devastating in their life. Like one time when I was younger, I was in a car accident that was really bad. Granted, everyone was okay at the moment. Very, very, very traumatic and like anxiety producing. If something else happened later on in my life, all it would take is for me to think to myself quickly, even if I don't realize it, oh, this is worse than that time I got in a car wreck. Now, without me wanting it to happen, the stress and anxiety that I experienced during that time, I just equated this new thing to be worse than that. My body will react as if it's worse. I can't control that. The way I look at anxiety here and the way behavior analysts look at anxiety is like we're kind of stacked a deck that will help us in the immediate short term be able to usually avoid those situations. Like, I don't want to step into solving this problem because it's going to cause me more harm potentially to deal with this anxiety in the stressful situation. And historically, that's usually worked out pretty well for us evolutionarily. The people that avoid stuff like that tend to stick around for longer. We're now, I look at it as in a society to where most of those daily pressures, like not having shelter, food, having predators after you, those are pretty much gone. So we're still stuck with that anxiety likely thing to happen to us that we can't control, but there's new things that now come in and enter and induce that. So with climate specifically, like anybody could purposely or accidentally be like, oh man, this situation that's going on with the climate is worse than, or is going to be more impactful in negative ways than these other things I've experienced in life. And it can quite cripple somebody in the moment. It's this weird situation where, like, from our perspective, that's what's going to likely happen is you're likely going to avoid situations. It's the easiest thing to do in the moment to immediately remove yourself from that. The solution to these sort of things is typically what we talked about with values and getting people to do a little bit of experiential work around what is it that you value and how can you do little things towards those despite the anxious response. And what that'll produce is if you get people to do just a little step, those little steps actually, the reward of those little steps they're taking will outweigh the anxiety response for most people. If not, you've gone too far on like how much you're interacting with it. So I know that was a lot there, but like that is why it's happening, is like we uniquely engage in language. That language happens faster than in ways that we literally cannot control. If you recognize the process, you can start to make some steps towards how do I rectify it through doing values-based work. So if we took an example of what y'all are doing here, you could sit back and worry about what's going on with the world, or you can engage in behavior that leads to recording a podcast, putting a podcast out there. That podcast, while it's not solving climate change tomorrow, it is both, I think, simultaneously checking off your internal reward systems, right? Of we're doing something to make this a little bit better, but it's also allowing you to gain a little bit of momentum to things that are going to have a bigger impact later on. Like it's kind of like a double reward.
So on the one side, we're trying to fool ourselves that we're actually doing something, while on the same side, like if you're actually picking something that's useful, it can nudge towards some change that is worth doing.
Yeah. All forms of anxiety will always have some sort of a escape or avoidance. So like I try to get out of things that make me anxious, or I try to avoid things that make me anxious. And that's a predominant factor. So I think when people are really running into situations like that, like it is typically someone that does some good talk therapy or some good therapy. Like good therapy can really help you get over that. It is a difficult thing to get over on your own. Like there's some forums where they call it like bibliotherapy, like books that can help you kind of get over the hump. Like if it's debilitating, it's beyond bibliotherapy, right? But if someone's like, yeah, this stuff stresses me out and I want to do something about it, you're probably in a good spot to just, pick up some materials and get running with it.
I was watching the movie Don't Look Up.
Yeah.
Some people stood up because they couldn't finish the movie.
There's a 100% chance that we're all going to die.
Well, the handsome astronomer can come back anytime, but the yelling lady, not so
much.
It's also because they have some more traumatic events that happened back in their earlier lives.
That's it. Like they're like what's going on in their internal monologue when they're watching that is they're relating in ways that you don't have experience from since you have different learning history. And so that's why it might look like you might be like, oh, how did you not finish that? Like, why is that so impactful? Kind of pointed back, I was saying like the earlier you can kind of equip people with these sort of skills. Like if I could wave a wand, we'd do a lot of early education on like how language impacts your life, but also a lot of critical thinking skills. And it's not going to solve every problem, but it's going to allow people to kind of realize like, oh, in this moment, if I get up and walk away from this movie, it is also leading me to more likely getting moving away from these things in the future because it's rewarding to get away from it now. And I'm more likely to do it again in the future. But it's also like, I now no longer am in a spot where I can talk with Tom or other friends about that movie, like it actually impacts other things in the moment when you get away from that. Not only does it make the anxiety probably worse, but it's also going to impact your relationship with the people that sat through it, so it can kind of spiral in multiple ways pretty quick.
Generational trauma, man, it does things to you.
Charlie's like, I don't buy it. It's all bullshit.
Yeah. I don't know what you people are talking about. I'm scared
I can handle that, by the way, too.
No, I it's interesting. So I had my first, if you want to call it that, like awareness of climate anxiety last year in the springtime in Texas. We have we call them mayflies. They come out in like swarms every spring. and it was a very dry year last year. And there weren't any mayflies whenever it was like around the season that they were supposed to start coming out. It was one of those things that it's like every year for my whole life, you kind of expect that, right? It's like, oh, it's the changing of the seasons. Oh, here are these stupid mayflies. It's just this routine that you get into every year. And this is the first year that I didn't notice them. And it was this really anxiety-inducing sort of underlying thing that I realized it was a loss of control for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, wow, this is the first time in 30 years that I have not experienced this sort of normal, natural cycle. Just to really experience that was very anxiety inducing. I almost wanted to just like give up climate like stuff, and kind of what you're saying, I wanted to almost run from it and just be like, this isn't happening.
Yeah.
And it was a perspective shift for me of how much even small little things like that can really affect your behavior. Me coming out of like that sort of initial anxiety last spring ended up being ultimately motivating for me. Let's put the gloves on. Let's go. You know, it's here kind of a thing. But I can see how it affects people differently.